Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eterberg, and today I'm discussing the 1927 film Two Arabian Knights with my friend Shawna Carroll, who writes the Notes from Post newsletter. Shawna, thank you so much for joining me to talk about Two Arabian Nights today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really fun. I've always enjoyed old classic movies.
Excellent. Well, before we jump into talking about Two Arabian Nights, tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so I am a television and film producer. I executive produce and produce. I focus mainly in post, so hence why my newsletter is called Notes from Post. It's a much less emphasized portion of the industry, and so that's one of the things that I really want to help bring a light to, kind of like there is this whole aspect of the industry that's just not as glamorous, and so that's what my hope is, to be able to help people better understand that side of the industry.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast to talk about an old movie here today. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I want to cover the basics of the film. Two Arabian Nights debuted on September 23rd, 1927. It was directed by Lewis Milestone, and the screenplay was by Wallace Smith, Cyril Gardner, James T. O'Donoghue, and George Marion Jr. It was based on a serial story of the same name by Donald McGibney, which originally appeared in McClure's magazine in 1924.
Two Arabian Nights stars William Boyd as W. Dangerfield Phelps III, Mary Astor as Mirza, and Louis Walheim as Sergeant Peter O'Gaffney. It runs for approximately 92 minutes, was produced by John C. Considine Jr. and Howard Hughes, and distributed by United Artists.
The film did receive the only ever Academy Award for Best Comedy Direction at the first Academy Awards, and you can find some people selling it on DVD, but I'm not sure. They're kind of bootleggy versions of it from everything I've seen, but there's also a readily available version on YouTube as of this recording. I guess we can get right into the story of Two Arabian Nights. It opens with these two soldiers, Phelps, that you mentioned, and Sergeant O'Gaffney. They're stuck in a bomb crater in no man's land. And Phelps is I don't know if he's a private or what he is, but he's the lower ranking of the two. And he's always apparently had it headed out for his sergeant.
Yes.
And decides to pick a fight in the middle of this crater in the middle of the war.
When he thinks no one's watching.
Right. And about 2 minutes later, they're entirely surrounded by Germans, and they are summarily captured and marched off to a POW camp.
Yeah. So I think this was one of my favorite parts, just because it's like instantly grasping you into the film, because it's already creating like high stakes. Like, how are they going to get these people now that hate each other are now have to be on the same side to be able to escape somehow.
Exactly. And honestly, it had two of my favorite shots of the entire film when the Germans surround them.
Yes.
There's the one shot. I think the first one is from above. You see the men down in the hole.
Yeah.
Germans are surrounding them. They all have their bayoneted weapons pointed. And then the other one is from below, kind of that same reverse angle.
Yes.
It's a nice juxtaposition there. So they're marched off to the POW camp, and you mentioned they're not quite friends yet. They do the, kind of kicking each other as they're marching and tripping each other, stuff like that. But I guess eventually they do kind of come to an agreement, I guess, around the drawing that Phelps makes of one of the guards.
Yes.
And he hands, if I'm trying to remember correctly, he hands it to the sergeant, who's kind of laughing at it. And then the guard sees the sergeant with it and thinks that he drew it, but then Phelps ends up taking the fall for it. Says, no, I drew it. And that kind of solidifies their friendship there.
Yeah, that's definitely like the first step. And then it's the two of them, right? Like the two of them going back and forth and doing funny things. And the comedy aspect of it, I personally love that like vaudeville, like old school Silentville type Three Stooges comedy. It was very Three Stooges.
Yeah, I did too. And I, obviously it is billed as a comedy, and having seen the other two films, and going off a little bit on this, seeing the other two films that were originally nominated this first Oscars for
Best
the Comedy Direction Awards, it was The Circus from Charlie Chaplin and the Harold Lloyd comedy Speedy. My opinion, from what I've seen, both way funnier than this movie. It kind of again, we'll get to it a little bit later, but it kind of annoys me that this one ended up
One
winning,
somehow, yeah,
but,
yeah.
that's there's always controversy at the Oscars, I suppose.
There's always controversy, and I also think that it has to do with the fact that it came right on the heels of World War One, and so that was just a lot of the rhetoric that was going on back then, and, like, the Oscars really does have it's voted on by peers, and
Mhm.
so a lot of us, when we're voting on films, will vote based off of what's going on in, like, the
Yeah.
real world at the moment.
Yeah, and that's another note I had too, that there just in even in this first, Oscars, obviously, we're about almost 10 years removed from the end of World War II in 1927, 1928, when these films are being made, but there's at least 3 or 4 out of the nominees that first year were set in World War II, or
Yeah,
sorry, World War One.
yeah.
And the other one that a number of them were set in was the Russian Revolution of all things. So it's like those, and again, 10, 15 years
I was gonna say
distant
that's
from,
yeah.
yeah, from those events. So it's recent events that people are paying attention to in those days.
Well, and then Lewis Milestone won Best Oscar the following year for another war movie that he made, All Quiet on the Western Front,
Yes. Yep.
which
Yeah.
yeah, which
Another
was
World
really
War
good.
One. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. So they're in this POW camp, and uh, the other thing that I noted, I had to make a comment about how the prisoner intake system, they're doing, they have this commanding officer doing very individualized inspections of every prisoner coming in. I'm like, can't you hand that off to someone,
Right?
some secretary or
Yeah.
something? And then the line, it was one of the titles that came across the screen when they go in to get bathed, and it just says the Cooties Crematory. That was one of the moments where I actually laughed out loud, was that line.
Yes, yes. I like that too.
Eventually, they manage to plan an escape, and they steal some sheets or robes from a fellow prisoner and end up hiding in the snow using those white robes. They have the gag where they're holding the electric fence up with
Yep.
little pieces of sticks and it starts to fall. They also have to distract the German Shepherd guard dog.
Yeah.
To your point earlier, it's very,
Like all of the events that was placed in the writing was really funny
yeah,
and
yeah.
built on each other. And then the white road when they get wet and the white roads are all like frozen solid.
Yep, I laughed at that too. And actually I thought that when because they're frozen solid and then they eventually make it to indoors, someplace where it's warm, and
And
there was
then
some effect where it kind of melts and you could
yeah,
see they're being held up with strings, but I'm like, okay, at the time, that's how I would do it too. There's no
yeah.
CGI, there's no models.
And, like, even I mean, the Great Train, right? Like, people got so freaked out. So, like, just moving pictures in general is so realistic that I think there was a lot more that was forgivable by the audiences back then.
Yeah, for sure. So they end up, once they escape, they end up on this train, which is heading to Constantinople because they're mistaken as, I guess, Arab prisoners because of their white robes that they
Yeah,
stole. So they're herded off onto this train. They kind of, there's, I guess, a little bit of a time jump because it probably takes some time to get from Germany to Constantinople in those days on train, and they end up jumping off the train onto a hay cart, and then with that is loaded onto a ship, and they fall out of the hay and into the belly of the ship, and it's just it almost feels like a Looney Tunes cartoon at sometimes.
that's such a great way of explaining it. It is 100% like a Looney Tunes type.
Yeah, I could totally see Bugs Bunny and Wile E. Coyote doing a Two
Yeah.
Arabian Nights remake, and it making total sense.
Yes.
So they end up on this ship, and of course they're, I guess, stowaways at this point. So somehow Phelps' character has some money on him, where he got money from being in prison and then on this train in the hay cart, I don't know, but he ends up being able to pay for their passage on the ship. And then we finally get to see the Mirza character, Mary Astor, on
Yeah.
this little boat that's nearby that capsizes, and Phelps jumps into the water to try and save her, and then he starts drowning. So O'Gaffney has to jump in and save both of them and get them,
Of
yeah,
course he
and get
starts
them
drowning.
back on the ship. And that's kind of where the whole love story aspect of this finally starts. And we're, I don't know, halfway into the movie at this point, I want to say, if not more.
Yeah. And then right, and then they've somehow become somewhat friendly, and now all of a sudden there's this break between them again, and now they're not friends because 'cause they're competing for they've escaped, they've done that, and now, okay, the next thing is who's gonna win the girl?
And if you've ever seen these movies, it's pretty obvious who's going to win the girl because
Yeah.
Phelps is the good-looking, dashing man, and Gaffney's
Yeah.
got the busted nose, and
He's the sidekick character for sure.
so eventually they get their clothes dried off, which is a whole other gag with them trying to dry their clothes in their quarters,
Dry each other's clothes and steal them and make them re-wet. Yeah.
throw each other in the bathtub, and all that stuff. And eventually they get to spend some time with Mirza, and she ends up removing her veil, which she's had on this entire time, and showing her face, which of course is not something that is done of for women in that culture at this time.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
So then now they are getting near to their destination, which I guess is an unnamed Arabian city. We know it's Arabia is what I remember seeing on the screen, no specific destination. But they then have to figure out a way to pay for Mirza's passage on the ship because she was not, she capsized and she wasn't supposed to be on the ship in the beginning. And O'Gaffney ends up robbing the purser of the ship to pay the captain, and then they're allowed to leave the ship. And of course, she is met by no one other than her fiance.
Fiance. Yep. That the guys didn't know about. Yeah.
Right? Yeah, we didn't know about that until that moment. It would have been nice for her to mention that when she was flirting with the guys a couple days before.
Listen, a girl's gotta do what a girl's gotta do in those in hard times, right? Like, she was
That's
all
right.
alone, she needed someone to protect her.
That's right. That's right. But she actually wasn't all alone because she had I don't know, minder, or
Oh,
there's
that's right.
somebody with her
That's right,
that
that's
saw
right.
her take off her veil and kind of spilled the beans to the fiance that she's been up to no good with these two Americans.
That's right, I totally forgot. Yep.
So they end up bailing off the ship, heading to the console in the city that they ended up in, and of course the ship's captain is there ahead of them and kind of looking for these two soldiers. They end up going to Mirza's father's palace or whatever to try and get some help from him because after all he owes them for paying for her fare on the ship. She hands them a note that says, "Hey, it's a trap," kind of thing, but they don't read it until they're all the way inside. And again, they manage to escape, but it's just kind of like, they just it just happens. There's no rhyme or reason to how these things happen. It's just like, yep, they have to escape, so they do,
Yeah.
and they beat up all the guards, and they're free. And I'm kind of reason through a lot of the ending here because it's just a lot of the same kind of gags towards the end. But eventually they do go back to try and rescue her one more time, and Phelps is, I guess, challenged by the fiance to a duel.
That's right.
I think at first they're going to do it with swords, but then they decide to do it with pistols. And he says gives Phelps the choice of two pistols. One has a blank, the other one has a live round in it. And the Bruiser's standing there. Of course, she doesn't want anything to happen. Phelps shoots, and his is the blank. So she runs off into the other room, and then it's revealed that the fiance's is also a blank.
Yeah.
But because she didn't see it, she thinks that Phelps is dead. Fiance goes off to take her. I'm trying to remember the exact proceedings of the ending, but eventually they end up somehow the two main characters end up in the carriage outside and kind of whisk her away at the very end as the fiance goes to put her in the carriage. They're all the Phelps and O'Gaffney are already in the carriage and ride off with her, presumably to a happy ending at the very end.
Happily ever after.
And I had to note at the very end, I think it's the very last shot is a little bit of a fourth wall break from O'Gaffney because he's driving from the front of the carriage and he looks back into the carriage, but it's also right into the camera, which I thought was obviously we talk a lot about that nowadays with Ferris Bueller or Deadpool, things like that.
Well, because for so long, right? I think in the beginning of cinema, and this very like the first 20, 30 years of cinema where things were still kind of very loosey goosey and we were figuring out that medium, there weren't as many set rules. Like we hadn't discovered yet, like the 180 rule, and don't break the fourth
Yeah.
wall and all that. And
Yeah.
then once those rules were in place, everyone was like, oh, well, those are the Oscar winners. So we
Right.
have to follow those rules. And so those rules kind of became the staple until, the last 30, 40 years of film where people are like, oh no, we're gonna be more rebels and try doing some more experimenting with those kinds of things again. And now again, like breaking the fourth wall has become much more normal.
It's almost jumped the shark again because it's been used so much as an effect. So anything that I missed in kind of the overview that I had? Can I kind of sped through that?
The physical comedy was really funny. I think it was very
Mhm.
physically comedic. I don't know if we've mentioned yet, just for anyone not knowing, that it's a silent film, and so, every once in a while, you'll get these text screens on camera, that will kind of explain what's going on or even add a little bit of dialogue between characters. But for the most part, everything kinda had the story has to really be carried by picture and the physicality of the characters, and so I think they really played a lot into that. Again, Three Stooges
Yeah. Yeah, for
comes to
sure.
mind.
And I thought it was best when it was just the two guys alone.
Yes,
When
agreed.
when they're escaping and bumbling through the snow-covered areas,
Yeah,
or when they're being chased by the guards, things like that. That's when it was at its best, when it was those two kind of playing off each other.
100%.
So I guess we can get into a little bit of the background of some of the individuals.
Let's do
You
it.
mentioned at the top, so William Boyd played W. Dangerfield Phelps. He was, I guess, in my research, best known for playing Hopalong Cassidy. I didn't actually count all of his credits, but I think it was over 40 credits for playing that
Wow.
character over the
Holy
years.
cow.
He was in the army in World War One, but didn't fight because he had a heart condition. And another fun tidbit is that, well, not fun for him. His photo was there's a news story about another actor who's also named William Boyd who was arrested. I forget what it was for, but they ran
His
this
photo.
William Boyd's photo, and basically he nobody would hire him for a couple of
Oh,
years until he started doing the
no.
Hopalong Cassidy thing. Yeah,
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that. That's so crazy. That would
yeah.
never happen nowadays.
Right, right. Yeah, you'd get sued to high
Yeah.
heaven for something like that.
Oh my gosh. Can we just talk about his character name right quick? Dangerfield. I love all of these old character names, like the way that they like the play on words.
Yep, yep,
Very
for
on the
sure.
nose, but for fun, but very fun.
Yeah. In terms of Mirza, played by Mary Astor, she, I guess, was best known for her role as Bridget O'Shaughnessy in The Maltese Falcon, which I haven't seen in probably 20 years. So now I have to go back
Yeah,
and
same.
revisit that because it's an excellent movie.
It is a very good movie. I remember watching it in film school.
Yep, that's where I saw it as well. She actually won an Oscar eventually for Best Supporting Actress in The Great Lie. And I think she's one of the ones that actually transitioned fairly well, it seems, from silent pictures into sound films. Obviously, a lot of folks didn't because of how they
Yeah,
sounded or whatever.
correct.
They had
But
to
she had a
shift.
pretty face and a voice, so
Yep,
they were like, "Great."
yep, the whole package. Louis Wolheim. We actually talked about him a little bit in the previous episode. He was in the previous one we talked about Tempest. Obviously, he's kind of almost, I think, typecast in that gruff,
Yeah.
either the villain or kind of a mobster type, or as this comedic sidekick. I think in the Tempest, he was a little bit more of a not so much sidekick, but similar type character where he's not the lead, but he's there as the comic relief in a lot of scenes. And then another one, it's funny, these actors, many of them are in a bunch of these films because they were just so
Yeah.
prolific with the studios at the time. Michael Visarov, we didn't mention him at the top. He was the boat captain. He also was in last episode's film, The Tempest, and will also be in another film, The Last Command, which I'll be discussing on the podcast in a couple weeks. So a lot of these bit characters, the bit players, are showing up over and over again. And then the one person that we didn't mention at the top, I mentioned his character when we were going over the plot, the purser. Did you look up and see who played him?
I did not.
Boris Karloff.
Oh, what?
Yep, and I went back and I watched that scene again. I don't think we even get to see his face. We only
Oh
see him from
my
behind, but
gosh. I never would have guessed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If Wikipedia and IMDb can be trusted, that was Boris Karloff, obviously, Mr. Frankenstein, and How the Grinch Stole Christmas himself.
Dude, that is so cool.
So yeah, so I wanted to mention him because I don't know. I think there is at least one other Oscar nominated film that he'll appear in at some point down the road. So I'll probably bring him up at some point to get on the podcast. But being that he was in horror films and those don't tend to get a lot of Oscar love, this might have been the only time that I had to mention him. So I wanted to bring up him since he
I love
was
yeah, absolutely, and that's a really fun little tidbit, especially since you don't necessarily he's not a main character and you're not really paying
right,
attention, so that's
right.
good to
And he obviously, this was before Frankenstein, so he wasn't.
Yeah,
He was this was his gig. He was just these bit parts whenever he could get them at this point.
that's so cool. And then are we talking about Louis Milestone next?
Yes, yeah. You have something on him?
Okay, so I have always loved his All Quiet on the Western Front, so that was one of the I did a paper on it because originally in film school I was gonna be a cinematographer, and so this is the first movie where they did, like, these big tracking shots and, like, big dynamic camera movements, which was very innovative and, like, groundbreaking for the time, which, is why it went on to win, Lewis the Best Oscar
Right.
in the next year's Academy Awards. But yeah, and then also something else that's super interesting about Lewis that not very many people know is that he started as an editor, like started as a film cutter and then transitioned into ADing and directing.
Yeah, the only note I had on him was that he kind of became a target of the Red Scare during the 40s and
Oh my
50s
gosh.
because he was
Yes.
born in Russia and was making pro-Soviet films for the government during the war, and then they turned around and used that against him when
Yep.
everybody was questioning allegiances later on.
Yep.
I watched All Quiet on the Western Front. I think I watched that in film school, but then I watched it again about 4 or 5 years ago, and it holds up.
Yeah.
I actually prefer the recent one that just came out a couple of years ago, just because
Yeah.
that's obviously you could do so
I
much more in
mean, what
2022 or
yeah.
2023, but the original
Exactly.
still holds up.
Especially for, like, a modern audience, you
Yeah,
can't compare the 2, but for the time, if you can, like, get yourself back into the setting
yeah.
of the time and the people and all of that, it definitely it was a really good film for the
Yeah,
time.
for sure. The other person I wanted to bring up, I don't usually talk about producers much on here, but Howard Hughes is obviously a well-known enough name
Oh,
that we
yeah.
need to kind of mention him here. This is, I think, one of his first, if not the first film that he produced. Obviously, a lot of people probably know him from the Scorsese film The Aviator, where he was played by Mr. Leonardo DiCaprio. He also produced the original version of Scarface in 1932. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah.
And obviously, a lot of words written about him, a lot of words said about him. So, but I just wanted to mention him here.
Yeah. And I don't think a lot of people realize that there was an original version of Scarface.
Yeah, yeah. I actually didn't know that. I about a year and a half ago, I interviewed an author on the podcast who wrote about Scarface, and I think it was some anniversary of the De Palma Scarface that he was
Okay.
writing the book for. But obviously, he spent some time talking about the original too. And until I read that book and did that interview, I had no idea there was an original one either.
Yeah.
So the other piece I wanted to touch on is the original story that this was based on. And I actually was able to read through it. I don't know if you had a chance to or not.
Oh. No, I didn't.
Yeah, so it was like I said at the top, it was a serial, which a lot of people probably don't even understand what that is now, where
Right? Because now they're all comic
yeah,
books. They're all considered
yeah,
yeah.
but there was about 20 pages of story in 3 different issues of this McClure's magazine.
Yeah, so way back when, there used to be these things called serial stories that would get published in snippets,
Yep.
and it was only writing, like, it didn't actually have images. The images in comic books came later, but, like, these little serial stories were super popular, and they were written, they became quite
Yeah,
popular, yeah.
yeah, and a lot of these, and I was just doing a little bit of research on the magazine that McClure's magazine itself. People like Mark Twain,
Yeah.
Robert Louis Stevenson, I think, big names that we know in literature today had stories and articles and things featured in these magazines, which was
Yes,
really cool.
yeah. And, like, a lot of serials is where filmmakers would find, like, inspiration for stories, so even if they didn't necessarily 100% use the serial, they would find inspiration and then take it and elaborate on it, or use the serial completely as the backdrop for their story for
Yeah,
sure.
and this one, I wished that the film had stuck more to the story. The serial
Oh, was
story,
it better?
yeah, well, I don't know
And
if it
I'm
was
guessing it
better.
wasn't funny, right? It's not a funny
No,
serial.
it's meant to be. It's still the kind of they're out of the frying pan into the fire over and over and over again.
Okay,
So
okay, yeah,
it's
yeah.
just nonstop, and that's almost the one thing that I wish the film had done a little bit better was not stay too long on certain things. I wish the gags had been a little bit closer together,
Quicker.
if anything.
Yeah.
But the one thing that I found the story actually picks up on the boat. So the whole thing with the war and the prison camp and all of that is before the
Short and
story.
upfront.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's just
Oh,
backstory of how
okay.
they met. So
Wow. And that's about half the movie.
right, and then the events of the story are kind of smushed together. The scene where they're in the restaurant is, that's several pages in the story.
Oh.
They're going back and forth to the console several times and running around this city for a couple days, in the story. So it's that part is all really condensed into that second half of the film, which is interesting. But I liked being able to have read that first and then see the movie and see
Watch.
how it compares.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go back and read it now.
Yeah.
I love reading some of those old serials.
Yeah, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. It's actually on you can find like people scanned the original magazine, on the Internet Archive, so it's
Oh,
available on
that's
there.
so cool. And just for clarification, for those who might not know, cereal with an S, not a C.
Yes, yes, thank you. The only other kind of fun fact trivia piece that I had was that the film was actually thought to be lost for many years.
Really?
Yeah, there was a copy that was found in Hughes's personal film collection after he died, and then
Wow.
the Academy and the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, preserved it and restored it a bit in 2016. So that's the version that I think is
Oh, that's
available
so
on
incredible.
YouTube.
Talking about films being lost, we as filmmakers, historically, so many like original films from the very, very beginning all got melted down, like the celluloid all was melted down for boots for the army in World War One because there was a scarcity of availability of that kind of material. And so we lost so many actual films from our archives because of that as in general our archives. But yeah,
Yeah, that's one of the hard. I kind of started this project as I want to watch all the Oscar films, but obviously it's impossible because there's a lot
because
of them
some
in
of them
these early
just
years
yeah,
they just simply don't exist
they
anymore.
don't yeah, exactly. Oh, that was something else that was really interesting, is that the film came out in 1927, but there wasn't Oscars yet. The first Oscars was in 1929. And so the Academy Awards decided to accept films, from August 1st, which is my birthday coincidentally, 1927, and this film came out in September, and so it, like,
Just
just
made the cut.
made it into the
Yeah.
made it into the cuts.
Yeah, that's the other thing too, and it was a couple years that they did that where, like, the first ones were 27, 28, and then it was, like, mid-year 28 to 29, so they kinda overlapped, and then finally they were like, "This is getting too confusing, let's just
Yeah.
do
Let's just
January
end
to
of year yeah,
December and make it
yeah,
easier."
exactly. And then they also ended up dropping the, Academy Award for Best Director in
Yep,
Comedy.
yep, this is the only year that it existed.
In my opinion, I think is such a loss
Yeah.
because it's such the genres are so different and they take such a unique set of skills to get correct. That's one of the categories I wish we could bring back, honestly.
Yeah, I'd love to see and it's funny looking at, some of the one that comes to mind recently is Green Book, a couple years ago, because that was,
Oh, that was such a good
I
movie.
forget which Farrell brother, or Farrell? Farley. Now I'm questioning the last name there, but
I'm gonna
he
Google
was
it.
but they I mean, they were comedy directors, and then they shifted to, he shifted to something a little bit more serious,
Yeah.
and
Peter
Peter
Farrelly.
Farrelly, yes,
Mhm.
thank you. And then they're winning awards for it. So,
And that's it, right? It's like it's the same person, it's the same caliber of
yep,
person. It's just that they switched into what's considered an artistic
right.
film, and
Yeah,
then they win an Academy Award for it. And I just feel like there's such a loss that happens with not including, like, comedy or even more categories for animation or even more categories for post-production because there's so much more to the art form than just the storylines that are a little bit more out there or the storylines that are just more, like, human based, and comedy is one of those things. Comedy is important, honestly, comedy is what keeps humanity going, like, if we didn't have something if we didn't have any form of levity, what would be the point? And so, I personally truly, love comedy films and would love to see that category back, but it will never happen.
yeah, yeah. No, I'm on board with that. They tried a couple of years ago to introduce the popular film category, which kind of
Yeah.
went by the wayside. I haven't heard
Oh
much
my
about that
gosh.
recently, but
There's been so much controversy with the Oscars the
yeah.
last few years, so
But that's another one where I feel obviously a lot of people are thinking, "Oh, that's where you're gonna put your Marvel movies and your Star Wars and your," but
right, right.
comedies could very easily go in there as well.
And that's like okay, so I know we're supposed to be talking about this film, but just real quick, that's a whole other aspect, right, of the Academy Awards, like, there's these big blockbuster films that aren't, quote, unquote, "considered artistic," but, like, so many people artists
Yeah,
pour their heart and soul and, like, their lives, like,
thousands of
when
people.
we're thousands of people. When we're filming or when we're in post-production, like, that is all we're doing. We're giving up time with our families, we're giving up and, like, to not be able to even be considered for the Oscars because it's considered, a lower brow
Yeah,
tier is I don't know, it's really disheartening for me, and I'd love to be able to, like, include more, subcategories or subgenres,
sure.
even if it's not doesn't make it onto the show, you know what I mean? Like, even if it's just, like, a smaller award ceremony or, like, a sub award ceremony, that would be good.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally agree. Anything else, in terms of trivia or anything on, Two Arabian Nights that you wanted to add?
I think you were very gracious in letting me interrupt you many times, so I appreciate that. So I think I hit everything that I wanted to, hit on.
Perfect. Well, I had one other one. I mentioned at the top or mentioned earlier when we were kind of starting off that I was a little bit surprised that this beat out Chaplin and the Circus, and then the Harold Lloyd film Speedy for the best comedy award, best comedy direction award, I should say. I also found an essay on from the, I guess it's a journal film comment from 2017. I like this couple quotes from this. It said, "As the titular pun implies, Two Arabian Nights will never earn credit as a positive landmark in cultural representation, especially once the action shifts to the unspecified Arabian region where the last half hour transpires." And then he says, "The film is just as much about the bumbling quality of mid-Atlantic Caucasian masculinity and the chronic inability of U.S. citizens abroad to imagine that the foreigners around them may be cleverer and better educated than they." I thought that summed up so much
So
in
good.
those two little quotes about this
That's a
film
great
that
quote, yeah.
apply to obviously we're better at representation today, but it's still a work in progress in a lot of cases.
100 years later, we're still working on it.
So yeah, so I think I've touched on pretty much everything I had in my notes. I want to get to some final thoughts and give some ratings.
Yeah, let's do it.
So I will go first. I had this at a 7 out of 10, which is kind of, I think, a sweet spot. It's good, it's funny, but
Yeah.
it's not it's not going to be ever be the top of any lists, but it's still a fun film to spend an hour and a half or so watching.
Totally agree. I was there with, like, a 6, 7. I was kind of it's more than a 5, but it's not quite an 8, and so I was there in a 6, 7. Same reason, like, it was funny. I think that their performance was really great and their physicality was really great, but again, it's not anything to write home about.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I will be sure to include a list of resources, a link to the story, like I mentioned earlier, as well as a couple of reviews in the episode notes, and also include a link to where folks can watch the film on YouTube, at least as of right now. Sean, I want to thank you so much for coming on to talk about Two Arabian Nights today, and just remind people once again where they can find you online.
Yeah, thank you again so much for having me. It's been so wonderful. You can find me at on Substack at notesfrompost.substack.com, and you can subscribe there. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you.
Excellent. And don't forget to follow the Oscar Project at theoscarproject.substack.com. And be sure to come back for this Friday's episode of the podcast where I will be going over the nominees for the 97th Academy Awards and giving some immediate reaction and initial predictions.
I can't wait.
Thanks for listening, and I will see you at the movies.